All right, with that said, we'll go ahead and get started with our presentation on cross-cutting environment spotlight, the exciting world of environmental reviews. My name is Ben Stern. I'm with the Cloudburst Group, and joining me here today is Brian Schlossnagle from HUD's Office of Environment and Energy. So let's take a quick look at some of the learning objectives today. We're going to provide a basic overview of the environmental review requirements, share some tips and best practices, and talk specifically about how you can minimize flood risk and avoid adverse impacts to floodplains and wetlands. So some key topics that we'll be going over today will be the environmental review requirements, determining the level of review, streamlining opportunities, and talk about some specific requirements for CDBG-DR projects, and then also share some resources that will be helpful in guiding you through the environmental review process. And then hopefully at the end of our presentation, we have plenty of time for some question and answers. All right, so let's talk environmental reviews. So just, as many of you may know, HUD has two sets of regulations for environmental reviews. When Part 50, when HUD is acting as a responsible entity and completing the environmental review. And then there's the Part 58 regulations, where the responsible entity, states, units of general government, assume the responsibility of carrying out the environmental review. So today's presentation will really be focusing more on those Part 58 regulations. So what is an environmental review? It is a process of information gathering, analysis, and documentation to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act and its related laws and authorities. The objective of the environmental review is to document that HUD projects are not harming the environment and that the environment is not impacting our projects. Responsible entities are to make an informed decision about how their project will be impacting the environment. This consists of identifying and analyzing known or potential environmental concerns that could adversely affect occupants of the project, as well as how the natural resources and community resources are affected as well. These reviews help ensure that HUD provides decent, safe, and sanitary housing, and also community infrastructure. So if projects have potential for causing harm to the project, or the environment has potential to cause harm to the project and its occupants, then that's an adverse impact to sanitary and safe housing. How your project is going to impact the environment and how the environment impacts your project and its occupants are questions that you're going to need to answer and address through the environmental review process. The environmental review needs to document compliance with up to 17 federal-related environmental laws and authorities. Pending the level of review, more or less analysis might be needed. Regardless, the documentation and best faith effort to show that the entity's due diligence to determine compliance with these statutes is presented in what is known as an environmental review record. The environmental review record, this is a public document. Public input is a key part of the environmental review process. You may not always have the full array of facts about potential impacts, be they social, economic, or environmental impacts. So others are given an opportunity to bring these to the table. So again, public input is an important piece of this review process. Finally, the environmental review is required for HUD projects and cannot be waived. The review itself must cover all anticipated activities as part of the overall project and not just those that are being funded through HUD money. All CDBG-DR projects require an environmental review record, and some are going to be quite simple, while others may take more time. So let's talk about the timing of the environmental review. When should your environmental review begin? This should be happening at the earliest phase of the project planning process. And believe me, this will save you more time in the long run to get the environmental review started and make sure you get all the information you need at the forefront. HUD regulations at 58.22 specify that environmental review must be performed before any funds, regardless of source, are committed to the project. The requirement for not committing or spending funds applies not only to you as a grantee and your partners, but also individuals, developers, state and local entities that are requesting assistance. This could include other departments within your jurisdiction that are also receiving CDBG assistance from you. They would be subrecipients, and they too cannot commit or spend funds until the environmental review has been completed. So Part 5822, also known as choice limiting actions, includes acquisition of property, even if the property is being acquired by non-HUD funds, signing agreements that commit you prematurely to an action before you know all the facts, and spending money to undertake project-related activities. Part 58.22 also says that you have to have a written environmental review record beforehand and cannot take actions before the environmental consequences are fully known. Remember, the goal here is to avoid adverse impact. So key takeaway, do not spend a dime or do anything with your project until the environmental review process has been completed. This process typically concludes with the responsible entity submitting the request for release of funds, or HUD Form 701515, making sure, yep, we got that corrected. And then getting the authority to use grant funds, HUD Form 701516, from HUD. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the different roles and responsibilities under the Part 58 process. I'd like to first take this back to NEPA. The National Environmental Policy Act dictates that all federal agencies must evaluate the environmental impact of federally assisted projects. So in response to this, HUD created the Part 50 and 58 regulations for how they would comply with this requirement. Part 50 is when HUD retains the responsibility for the environmental review, but Part 58 passes this HUD authority on to responsible entities, who again are states, units of general local government, Indian tribes, Alaska Native villages, or the Department of Hawaiian Homelands when it is the recipient under the program. So as an RE, you are responsible for conducting the environmental review, including carrying out any necessary consultations, determining mitigation measures. So as an RE, and you also must prepare and publish public notices when required, such as a notice of intent to request release of funds and making a finding of no significant impact. The responsible entity must also submit the request for release of funds to HUD and then notify grantees when environmental clearance has been made. In some cases, the responsible entity would assume the role of HUD. An example of this would be when states provide HUD funds directly to units of general local government, who would then assume the role of the responsible entity and submit the request for release of funds to the state. And then the state would act as HUD and grant the authority to use grant funds. Another role in the process is that of contractors and consultants. Consultants can be very helpful in streamlining the environmental review process and for responsible entities, especially when staff capacity is an issue. But it is very, very important to realize that even though consultants can be used to prepare the environmental review record, they cannot make determinations, they cannot make environmental findings, and they cannot carry out consultations. These are responsibilities that only the responsible entity can perform. It's also important when you're working with a consultant that the consultant has experience with HUD's Part 58 regulations in addition to NEPA and EPA requirements. So keeping with the Part 58 process, HUD has more of a limited role. HUD is available for support and technical assistance to responsible entities to help them carry out the environmental review process. They also grant the authority to use grant funds. And then they also may carry out environmental review monitoring to ensure compliance. If you're not sure who your HUD environmental contacts are, such as your regional environmental officer or your field environmental officer, you can ask your CPD rep. You could go on HUD Exchange, and there on the environmental review webpage, there's a contacts list that breaks each HUD environmental contact out by region and provides all of their contact information. All right, so let's start talking about the different levels of environmental review. It is important to keep in mind that the project description feeds directly into the determination of level of review. This is because levels of review is determined by the types of activities involved in a project. You have lower levels of review and higher levels of review. The level of review mandates how in-depth your project is. So for example, if you have a bulldozer on site, you're more than likely going to be having a higher level of review. Whereas if your activities include more planning or administrative costs, then you're looking at a lower level of review. Each level of review comes with specific compliance requirements that you will be responsible for, and each has an anticipated time frame for completion. So there are 5 different levels of review. They'll really just be focusing on 4 of them today. And I'm going to start with the lower levels. Exempt actions are sort of like soft costs. They include activities such as planning, engineering, or environmental services and administrative costs or public services. Categorically excluded to, not subject to the laws and authorities at 58.5 or simply CENST are very similar non-physical type activities that include more rental assistance when the assistance is tied to the tenant, operating costs, and maintenance. Both exempt and categorically, one more thing about CENST reviews, they can also include supplementary assistance when you have a completed environmental review and additional sources are being added to the project. The same responsible entity that completed the original review, as long as no scope is changing, can conduct a CENST review for that supplemental assistance. The average time frame for exempt and CENST activities can take 1 to 5 days, give or take. Now, looking at the higher levels of review, let's first start with categorically excluded subject to the laws and authorities at 58.5 or CEST. These activities will usually have a physical impact and can include acquisition and leasing, disposition, public facility and infrastructure improvements, ADA improvements, and minor residential rehab activities. There's a lot of complexity, technical complexities when it comes to categorical exclusions, specifically with minor rehab, repair, and improvements. So instead of going through all of that with you today, just be sure to read the Part 58 regulations. If you're not sure whether you have a rehab activity that would fall under CEST or trigger a higher level review, just check the regs or reach out to your regional or field environmental staff. The typical timeframe for CEST reviews can typically take between 30 or 90 days. Now, environmental assessments is a different animal. These activities include new construction, demolition, and major rehab. Also, any activity that would result in a change of land use would also trigger the need for an environmental assessment. These are much longer reviews and can typically range from 45 days to even up to a year. All right, so let's look at what's required for each level of review. We'll start with the exempt and CENST reviews, but it's important to state that all projects, regardless of the level of review, must meet compliance with the other requirements under 58.6. This includes flood insurance and disaster protection, Coastal Barrier Resources Act, and airport and runway clear zones. Once you document compliance for CEMST and exempt reviews for those 3 requirements and no issues come up, then that's really it. You sign your environmental review record, put it in your project file, and no further action with public notices or reaching out to HUD is needed. But for projects that are not exempt, such as CEST or environmental assessments, in addition to 58.6, you must also document compliance with the laws and authorities at 58.5, also known as the fun stuff. So these can include complying with several laws and executive orders, such as the Endangered Species Act, National Historic Preservation Act, and Executive Order 11990 on wetlands, just to name a few. Remember, there's 17 related laws and authorities. After analysis of the related laws and authorities for CEST reviews, you can either convert the review to exempt as long as no formal compliance steps are required or mitigation measures are tied to the review. Or if the review cannot be converted to exempt, then the responsible entity must proceed with issuing public notices, submitting the request for release of funds to HUD, and then waiting out to get that authority to use grant funds from HUD before they can complete the review. Environmental assessments, these require additional analysis under NEPA, such as determining the cumulative impact the project has on the environment and vice versa, as well as evaluation of alternatives. Environmental assessment factors take into consideration land development, how the project fits in the community, site safety, community facilities and services, including infrastructure, natural features, socioeconomic conditions, and most recently, climate change. Environmental assessments cannot be converted to exempt. Upon completion of analysis, the responsible entity would make a finding of no significant impact, also known as a FONSI, and this would require a public notices process, submission of the request for release of funds, and the authority to use grant funds from HUD. If you cannot make a finding of no significant impact, then that would trigger the need for an environmental impact statement, which is the highest level of review and which is also pretty rare given HUD projects. But if you ever think that you may need an environmental impact statement, please reach out to your regional environmental officer and they will help you through those steps. So this wraps up the basic environmental review requirements. So now I want to turn it over to Brian to start talking about the fun stuff.
First off, good morning, and thank you for participating in this conference. And thank you, Ben, as well, for that great overview of environmental reviews. One of the things that really resonated with me is the overall duration that can take to complete an environmental review, from just a few days to a few months to even possibly a year, depending on your scope of work. And all that kind of sounds a little counterintuitive to what we're trying to do for disaster recovery, because we're trying to assist our communities as quickly and efficiently as possible. So with this next section, we're going to take a look at different streamlining opportunities so that way you can efficiently navigate all those different laws and authorities, so that way you can help fast track the process and help those communities get back to where they were before, if not better. So our first streamlining opportunity is when an environmental review has already been completed by another agency and you as the responsible entity is able to adopt that environmental review. And there are two different avenues that you could take with this, and the first of which is probably going to be your most common for disaster recovery funds, and that is when an environmental review has been completed under the Stafford Act, i.e. when FEMA has done it already. So in this case, you are going to reach out to FEMA to obtain their record of environmental consideration, or their REC, and take a look at that REC to evaluate the scope of work, so that way you are comparing apples to apples and to see that it is still substantially the same. If it's not, you might have to go back out and conduct reevaluation. However, assuming that it is the same, there is the next step, which is actually very unique to the Stafford Act, where you are able to fully adopt the environmental review without further supplementing with HUD's unique requirements outlined in 24 CFR Part 58.5. So from there, the RE will retain a copy of that rec for your own personal records, and then you're immediately able to go ahead and submit your request for release of funds over to HUD. It doesn't require publication during that time since it's already been done and approved by FEMA. At that point, when HUD actually receives the request for release of funds, then they can immediately issue out an authority to use grant funds for your record, and you can go ahead and start expending and obligating funds. So that really fast tracks the process when the environmental review has been already complete. There's also a memo that was done in 2013 by HUD that really outlines this procedure, so that way you can take a look at that for reference. The other option for adoption is when HUD is relying on the CEQ adoption regulations found in 40 CFR 1506.3. And this is when an environmental review has been completed by another agency, but not under the Stafford Act. And there is a great process and flow chart for both environmental impact statements, environmental assessments, and also your categorical exclusions as well. So again, this kind of starts of gathering that environmental review record completed by another agency and evaluating the scope to ensure that's substantially the same and you're comparing apples to apples. However, the big difference here is when it comes to further supplementing that environmental review. So you don't have that bypassing that you have in the Stafford Act. And here you actually have to further supplement the environmental review record with HUD's specific requirements found in 24 CFR 58.5. However, you still have a vast majority of the environmental review record already complete, and you're able to really get things moving. Another good option for responsible entities to be aware of is the use of programmatic agreements, or PAs. So PAs help establish a streamlined process for handling routine environmental requirements for commonly encountered project types. I knew I was going to do this. So with that, PAs are set procedures and help outline your consultation process, review, and compliance with one or more federal laws and authorities, but can also be extended out to state, local, tribal laws as well, and kind of outlines the parameters of how you're going to tackle different issues as they come up before they actually do. So that way you have a means of an orchestrated plan to proceed with that overall layout. So a couple good PA examples that we have for DR. FEMA has put together a PA that HUD has put an addendum to address historic preservation, or Section 106. This has already actually been adopted by several states that you see listed before you. And if your state hasn't adopted that, this is a possibility that you can go ahead and take a look to see if it's right for your state to help establish that PA for Section 106. Another good example is in Puerto Rico. FEMA and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife have worked together to establish a programmatic agreement to address Endangered Species Act. So this has a whole matrix of effect determination for a whole slew of different common disaster recovery projects that really outline if you have X, Y, or Z project of what you will do in those circumstances. So that way you don't have to go back each and every single time for further consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and you're able to have a playbook in front of you of how to handle those situations and extremely fast track that process. A few other PAs that we have that are pretty common for environmental reviews in general that you can also incorporate for disaster recovery are for air quality, sole source aquifers, and coastal zone management. Another big option for streamlining is tiered environmental reviews. And this is really designed for specific circumstances. So this is, thank you. So this is really for when you're preparing a program of similar and repetitive activities. So think of your single family home repairs and where you have several unknown specific sites that are concentrated in a geographical area or region, such as a neighborhood or part of a city. So you do not know those specific sites, but you have a general geographical region that you can target. So instead of doing individual environmental reviews for each and every single one of those specific sites, which becomes very tedious, repetitive, and can ultimately require a lot of additional time, you can establish a tiered environmental review, whereas you are taking a look at your geographical region to knock out as many of the laws and authorities as you can that's ripe for review. And then once you've actually identified the remaining specific sites, then you can conduct the second portion of that for the subsequent site-specific reviews. So how does that actually work? So when setting this up, you're first going to define that regional boundary. So again, a neighborhood or a part of a city that you may have an interest with. And from there, you are looking to identify and evaluate all the different laws and authorities that you can satisfy with that specific knowledge in that region to try and cross as many off the list as you possibly can, and also identify those that you cannot. And from there, you're going to establish your standards, your constraints, and also your project, your process to follow and the subsequent stage of stage 2. Also during this time, this is going to be when you submit your request for release of funds to HUD for review and approval. Once you get your authority to use grant funds, I caution you, this does not allow you to go ahead and obligate and expend money. It's not until you complete stage 2 to have a complete environmental review package for that particular site that you can go ahead and start obligating and expending funds. So in stage 2, this is where you're going through and identify your specific location, your specific site, and also the specific scope of work. And you can complete the remainder of the laws and authorities to complete one complete environmental review package. Setting up tier environmental reviews can take a little while. And so I believe there was several new grantees in the audience. So as you're going through this process, there are a ton of resources on HUD Exchange to take a look at. And also, this is a good opportunity to reach out to your local field office for further consultation, so that way you can set up your tiered environmental review appropriately. So in addition, there are several different best practices that you can implement as a responsible entity to really help streamline things. The first of which is simply abiding by the regulation already outlined in 24 CFR 58.32, where you want to batch as reasonably as possible. So you may have an area that you have several sites in close proximity. So instead of conducting 20 different environmental reviews, if they're in close proximity, you may be able to group those logically together in one environmental review, drastically saving a lot of time and effort. Furthermore, you want to aggregate to the fullest possible extent. You may have several projects that have several phases associated with it. So instead of doing environmental reviews for each and every single phase, you want to try and incorporate that into one complete environmental review, which is going to save you lots of additional time. Another thing that's kind of unique for disaster recovery is the expedited public notice and condensed comments period. So this is specific for presidentially declared disaster areas, which allows the RE to publish the combined FONSI and request release of funds while simultaneously submitting that over to HUD for review. So you're basically reducing 30 days of comment down to 15 days. So this can be very useful if you have a project that you need to address right away, and time is of the essence. In addition, take a look at your local and state resources in the environmental departments. Oftentimes they have lots of great data that you can tap into to build out your environmental review record. In addition, they often have their own data sets for GIS, so making individual maps specific to that area can be drastically streamlined and expedited with very accurate information. Another good option is if you have lots of Section 106 or historic preservation considerations, it is always a good idea to pull someone on staff that is with the Secretary of Interior qualified person to help with that process and help navigate the Section 106 process. In addition, for new grantees, you're going to find that you have a lot more environmental reviews that you've ever processed before, and you may not be equipped with enough staff to package those environmental reviews. So a good option that Ben alluded to was pulling in consultants as well to help package those environmental review records. Again, I want to emphasize what Ben said as well, that the consultant isn't making determinations. That is still the responsibility of the RE to go through and evaluate the environmental review records for those determinations and consultations as well. In addition, it's important to bring your program staff and your environmental staff together early and often. This is kind of more of a management side of things. So that way you can discuss the overall workload that's going to occur with environmental reviews, set up your overall process of how things are going to be funneled from your programs department over to your environmental reviews, so you can start the environmental review process as early in the process that you feasibly can. In addition, it's a good opportunity to address potential bottlenecks and figure out what you can do to help resolve those. In addition, we kind of talked a lot about working with FEMA for acquiring the RECs for adoption. So it's very important to coordinate well with other federal agencies, so that way you can maximize your potential and really streamline the overall effects. So here we're going to switch gears over to our water elements. And probably to no surprise to the audience, flooding is the most common disaster in the country. So with that in mind, we want to ensure that we are taking a look at floodplains and how best to manage that in our environmental review process. And that is specifically outlined in 24 CFR Part 55. And there are three crucial elements that you're going to find in Part 55, and that is first, avoidance of the floodplain if possible, and second, if not, how to minimize the impacts of your project, and third, involving the public and providing a public notice for that. In addition, due to the severity of flooding, there are three prohibited actions that you should be aware of outlined in 55.1C, and those include any non-functionally dependent use in the floodway, any critical actions or new construction in coastal high hazard areas, and also any repair or reconstruction of non-critical actions that were not designated consistent with 55.1C3. So how do you evaluate your floodplain? What are you using to identify if you are or are not in the floodplain? So that's outlined in Executive Order 11988 and also Part 55, where you are required to use the best and available information to you. So this is often utilizing your flood insurance rate maps or firms and also advisory-based flood elevations. But that's not to say that you may have more up-to-date mapping from your local city, your county, or your state that has better updated information. In addition, utilizing your firms, that's going to be your key resource to determine flood insurance for any HUD-assisted project. Specifically, if you have a project located in the 100-year floodplain, that project is required then to have flood insurance. We're going to speak a little bit to this in another slide when we dive into it. Another crucial element is the protection of wetlands. So not only are wetlands this great diverse ecosystem with lots of plant and wildlife in it, but they are a valuable natural flood protection resource that also helps with shoreline erosion control. So this is our first line of defense that can help really promote resiliency of our communities. So we want to ensure that we are protecting wetlands to the fullest, which is outlined once again in 24 CFR Part 55. And it's worth emphasizing that this also has those same three key elements for consideration of trying to avoid, minimize impacts, and provide a public notice for wetlands. Also, you'll see a strong correlation between floodplains and also wetlands. So one of my favorite vacation destinations is Ocean City, Maryland. So you'll see some maps on the right-hand side where we have a firm on the very top right, outlining the 100 and 500-year floodplain. On the bottom right, we're using the Fish and Wildlife Services National Wetlands Inventory Map to identify wetlands. And you can see that there is a very strong correlation with the two. And that's by no surprise due to the nature of wetlands and the resiliency that they have to help protect against flooding. So how do you address, or what do you do when you have a project that's potentially in the wetlands or the floodplain? And the answer is really depending on your scope of work. Specifically, if you have new construction or substantial improvements, you're going to follow the 8-step process, which is outlined before you. However, if your project scope is a little bit more limited and you may be doing the purchase of existing housing or rehab or repairs of a unit, you will have a reduced 5-step process, which is color-coded before you. To summarize the overall 8-step, because we don't have time to really dive into much of the details, but there is tons of information out there on HUD Exchange. The overall concept is going back to those 3 critical elements that we talked about in part 55. So the first of which is avoidance. So during the 8-step process, we are mapping out our project site to determine if we are or are not in the floodplain or the wetlands. In addition, we're looking at different alternatives if we are. We want to take a look at the area to see if we are in the floodplain. Perhaps there is another site across the street that is suitable for the same project, but is outside the floodplain. Or you may have to consider different areas of your city as well. In addition, if there are no other alternatives, we're looking to minimize the impacts of the particular project on the wetlands, the floodplain, but also to the project itself and the inhabitants of that project, and also the surrounding community. So that may be taking a look and conducting different analysis. It may require you to take a look of reconfiguring your building, repositioning the building on the site to remove it out of the floodplain, but also incorporating different materials. So if you have a parking lot, maybe utilizing more pervious materials to help with the soil absorption as well. From there, you're also meeting the third and final thing with part 55, and that is public notice. So in the 8-step process, you have 2 distinct areas where public notice occurs, one at the very beginning to inform the public of the project, and one at the very end where you're talking about your overall mitigation measures and also your analysis behind that. So during this entire process, we talked about the importance of trying to mitigate and minimize overall impacts. And CDBG-DR has 2 great programs to really help with that process. The first of which is setting elevation standards. And this applies for new construction and substantial improvements to elevate those structures out of the floodway or floodplain. So for structures that are located in the 100-year floodplain identified on the firm, we refer to that as the base flood elevation or BFE. And we're going to want to raise those particular units or structures 2 feet above the BFE. For critical actions, on the other hand, which include hospitals, nursing homes, fire stations, police stations, and so forth, we're actually taking a look at the 500-year floodplain because of the importance of those overall buildings. We're also going to design a little bit differently. So we want to either design to the 500-year floodplain or 3 feet above the BFE, depending whichever is higher. In addition, it's important to note that historic or National Register of Historic Places or State Inventory of Historic Places, this elevation requirement is not applicable, but still may be worthwhile to take a look at. The final option for mitigation is buyouts, and this is intended for communities that are located in the floodway or floodplains that continually have routine flooding and damages to those properties. So this is a great opportunity to acquire those buildings and convert that area over to open green space. So you're kind of achieving 2 distinct things here. You're reducing the overall property damages by moving those people out of the floodplain. But 2, you're also increasing the pervious area. So now you have an area that's able to absorb a significant amount of water that is hopefully allowing you to have other communities that have a higher degree of resilience with that and to protect them. Okay, returning back to flood insurance, in the consolidated notice Appendix B, there's a lot of additional information of the specific flood insurance requirements. And we indicated that if you have a project that is receiving HUD assistance in the 100-year floodplain, that particular property is required to obtain and maintain flood insurance. So that's very important whenever you're communicating to any property owners that you're doing work of that specific requirement. And they are intended to maintain that property insurance throughout the duration of ownership. If they decide to sell that property, they are then required to inform any new property owner of that requirement. In addition, there is this requirement of the one-bite rule, which is kind of unique. Whereas this is listed in the National Flood Insurance Reform Act and also 24 CFR 58.6B. So there is a prohibition of federal flood disaster assistance for any person that received previous federal flood disaster assistance. So this could be from a former CDBG-DR grant, from FEMA funds, or any other federal agency that's provided flood assistance for that individual. In addition, they were required to obtain and maintain flood insurance, but failed to do so. So it's important for the grantee, for the grantee to communicate those requirements to the property owner, so that way they don't find themselves in a position that they won't be able to receive funds in the future. And in addition, being able to analyze that. So as you're taking a look at your applicants for your programs, verifying if they are or are not meeting the one-bite rule and are eligible to receive those funds. So the last thing that we want to discuss is actually HUD's proposed federal flood risk management standard, which was just published in March 24th, 2023, and it is currently open for public comment. So I encourage you all to review this in great detail and submit any comments by May 23rd, 2023. In addition, there is one more 1 hour open forum hosted by HUD to further discuss this. So we have very limited time here, so I encourage you to go to our HUD website to access the next open session, which discusses the purpose of FFRMS. But in summary, FFRMS is this new option to increase the flood resiliency of HUD's supported housing. And we do that by setting elevation standards for new construction and substantial improvements for all HUD programs. And for CDBG-DR, this is going to sound very familiar because you're already kind of ahead of the curve with those elevation standards that we've already talked about. However, FFRMS kind of goes one step further than what's already established in CDBG-DR. And specifically, that is utilizing climate-informed science approach, or SISA mapping, as HUD's proposed preferred mapping method. So this is a whole new mapping method that's currently in development. So it takes a lot of new data and variables to identify the elevation and floodplain of today, but then also utilizes climate science to determine what future flooding is going to look at 10, 20, 30 years down the road. So that way we can start designing our buildings to tolerate future storms and impacts and promoting further resiliency. So for those elevation requirements, we'll utilize SISA maps to design our overall elevation requirements. And as I indicated, these maps are currently in development and will roll out gradually over time. So in the meantime, we're actually going to operate under similar CDBG-DR elevation requirements. So if there is no SISA map available, we will utilize the 0.2% flooding approach, which is essentially just the 500-year floodplain identified in the firm and designed to that elevation. However, if the 500-year floodplain isn't mapped out on your firm, we will then utilize a freeboard value approach, which is in essence the 100-year floodplain on firms, and we are going to utilize 2 feet above the BFE or 3 feet above the BFE for critical actions. And finally, we have our key takeaways. So if there is one thing that you walk away from this presentation, Ensure your environmental review process is complete prior to spending or committing HUD and non-HUD funds. We don't want to see any choice limiting actions and have a potential issue to have to recapture funds and deal with those mitigation measures. Secondly is to figure out how best to streamline the process. We talked about adoption of environmental reviews, PAs, tiering, and so forth. In addition, is set realistic expectations not only for yourself, but also for your partners. Environmental reviews can take some time to complete, and it's important to budget time accordingly so that way you can complete those appropriately. And then finally, it is important, especially for our new grantees, to set up the review process for success. So this really requires you to take a look at your capacity, figure out your overall process flow, your program demands versus your staffing demands, and trying to fill any of those gaps that you may have. And finally, as much as possible, try to avoid projects located in the floodplain to promote resiliency. So thank you, and we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. I learned a lot. I'm sure the rest of the room did as well. Let's give them a round of applause. And as you can imagine, with such great material, we do have robust questions. And so I've been managing the online attendees, and thank you for all of our online attendees. About 100 in this room that aren't with us in spirit on the computer. So I'll go ahead and move those two off real quick. Just generally, it's about coordination of environmental reviews with consultants and any HUD requirements regarding that, and then clarification of choice limiting actions. So this question is from Rex. Attendance. Can consultants initiate, complete historic preservation consultations on behalf of the RE? I was under the impression that government-to-government consultation is the requirement specific to the tribes and SHPO.
So the role of the consultant is to help prepare the environmental review record. However, they cannot carry out consultations. So when it comes to Section 106 consultation process, it is the responsible entity that would need to be the one engaging with the state historic preservation officers, any tribal parties, and carrying out the consultation initiatives. The consultant can help prepare documentation, but they cannot initiate consultation.
Okay, yeah, this attendee had a follow-up. If they cannot, so can the consultant transmit or email consultation letters signed by the RE?
I would say that should probably still be on the behalf of the responsible entity.
Okay.
So maybe I'll let Brian take that one.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that. Are they just, is the responsible entity signing all the documentation, and are they just submitting the email?
That's the gist of the question, I think so.
I think that's kind of more administrative process, but I would try to caution for the responsible entity as much as possible to go through and submit.
Okay.
But I think the biggest thing is having the responsible entities sign all the documents, and they are officially making the determination in those circumstances.
Okay. And one question from Nicole Wise regarding choice limiting actions. This is when this question came up in the presentation. What if there is a $0 transfer of property and no funds used in acquisition? Does that still constitute choice limiting action?
I think there's probably some bigger questions to also ask with that is, what is the future use of the property? So in those circumstances, it's usually just not acquisition. There's another aspect to it that would put probably a federal nexus on it. So there's probably some other questions that you really need to dive into in order to make that determination.
Okay, we can open questions up to the in-person attendees. We'll go ahead and wrap this around.
And thank you very much for this wonderful information. Under the umbrella of hiring a consultant to help us aggregate pretty big allocation, which will be a lot of projects, how soon can we get started working to hire someone? And are there any procurement or solicitation don't do's that we need to keep in mind before we get started on this? We'd like to get as much of the environmental review process underway even while we're working on our action plan, if that's allowable.
Engineering or design.
Yeah.
So I would say that might be more of a program question, especially when it comes to procurement. But keep in mind the categorically excluded, not subject to level of review, CENST, that can be used to cover soft costs such as engineering, designing, using consultants for environmental studies. So that is something that you can conduct one of those lower level reviews to get them underway. And that would allow you to spend costs for that, those services, those planning services under that level of review, rather than waiting for the overall, if you're looking at an environmental assessment to be completed.
And then one other quick one, you mentioned the SOI, the certification. Can you talk a little bit more about what that is? And do you think it's important that a consultant should have that?
See,
It was that,
on best practices.
the SOI, the Secretary of the Interior qualified person.
Yeah, I think that really depends on taking a look at your specific needs and your staffing needs. So taking a good look of what your overall potential demand is for your environmental reviews. Do you have somebody already on staff with that capacity? But often having someone with that specific background can be very beneficial for Section 106. Yeah.
We're really short on environmental questions.
CDBG funds are being used for multifamily acquisition. To what extent should the alternatives aspect be considered? Should a developer have multiple option contracts to satisfy the alternatives site requirements?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question again?
So if I've got a multifamily developer that's buying a raw piece of land and we have to satisfy the consideration of alternative sites, should he have multiple option contracts to satisfy that requirement?
Are you referring to during the Section 8 process?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, it's while you're looking at it. So before you're even procuring, you're taking a look at different options as well. So you haven't really purchased that site
Right.
in the first place. So you want to keep things preventing that choice limiting action. So you wouldn't go ahead with the procurement until you complete that environmental review to take a look at all your different options that are on the table, because that could dictate that you may avoid one particular site that's in lieu of choosing another that's more favorable, that's outside the floodplain or wetlands.
Thank you.
I know it's early, but we do have 4 more minutes.
Good morning, thank you. You talked earlier about some of the timelines for completing some of those reviews, and could you maybe elaborate how the tiered approach, like a tier 1 and a tier 2, could affect those timelines and how those timelines may change or decrease if you're tiering?
Yeah, so going back with tiering, it really kind of depends on how many laws and authorities have you included in the broad level review. So one of the things that came up during our sessions yesterday for our one-on-ones is the appropriate size of that local geographical area. And typically, if you have too large of a robust area, there's very few of the laws and authorities that you can actually answer for the broad level review, which creates more work down the road when you're getting to that site-specific tier 2. However, if you have something that's more confined, you typically can knock out more of the laws and authorities, which allow you to really expedite the process there. So it's kind of a fine line of trying to hone in to an appropriate area, which doing that will kind of dictate how fast you can actually complete the tier 2. One of the great options of if you have a rehab program that you're starting, and while you're doing that, you can go ahead and establish your tiered environmental review. So that way, when it's actually in motion, you can already have that tier 1 broad level review complete. And so by the time you are ready to accept applications, you can have those ready to go and complete the tier 2 for those. So it really kind of depends what you have left, but can substantially expedite the process.
Can I add on to that? And just to add onto that, saving yourself time at the broad level, that's where you're doing your notice of intent to request release of funds and your HUD objection period for the authority use grant funds. So for notice of intent, if it's a CEST, that's 7 days public comment. If it's a combined FONSI, CENST, or notice of intent for environmental assessments, that's 15 days. And then it's a 15-day HUD objection period. So you could be saving yourself up to a month of just public comment and HUD objection by doing the broad level, because for each site specific, you don't have to go back to those steps again. So you don't have to do public notice or wait for the authority to use grant funds on each site specific tier 2 review.
Thank you. And one question we have time for. Did I see your hand up?
What would you do to recommend someone who do not have a programmatic agreement, where they start with that process, because it does save a lot of time and effort? So what would you recommend a state to do in order to get that started?
Yeah, I think you first start off with taking a look at your projects that you have to identify possible opportunities for a PA and which law and authority it makes sense to have one. From there, you want to determine the appropriate agency that you work with in order to establish your program or programmatic agreement. So if you're trying to address something with historic preservation, you're going to be working with your state historic preservation office, or for endangered species, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So that kind of starts an early consultation process and communication of how to articulate your program to them, to determine what you may be able to establish in order to really expedite that process. So there are a lot of other questions there. And
Well, thank you so much. We're at time. That was fantastic. Thank you to our presenters.